Hello Math 152 students. In this video, I want to address some of the frequently asked questions that you guys have sent me via email. Most of them had to do with what types of questions to expect and different ways that you can study different topics. So what I'll do is just go through our topic list quickly and talk about the types of questions and the ways that you can study. So certainly as you're thinking about reviewing, as mentioned before, your My Math Lab homework and then also your My Math Lab test are probably the number one place I would recommend that you go back to. So let's dive into our topics. In Chapter 1, you had lots of vocabulary. So these types of topics lend themselves very well to multiple choice questions when you are trying to distinguish between qualitative versus quantitative, discrete and continuous, and levels of measurement. You might also have some short answer or short explanations where you might have to explain why something is an experiment versus an observational study. So again, this isn't a complete list of the vocabulary. Make sure you're going back and studying the associated terms here in your complete vocabulary list. In Chapter 2, we moved on to using StatCrunch to create charts and graphs, but we also created charts and graphs by hand, such as filling in a relative frequency table or creating basic bar graphs or histograms by hand. So you want to make sure that you can do those things, that you can create a frequency and relative frequency distribution, and that you understand what type of chart and graph that I'm asking for. So making sure also in Chapter 2, you're understanding the associated vocabulary. Then think about answering questions, making decisions based off charts and graphs, and thinking about shapes of distributions. So right skewed, left skewed, bell-shaped, uniform, those types of things. So these concepts of shapes we continue to build on in Chapter 3, and then we'll also see them again in later chapters. In Chapter 3, this is the first place we were really starting to use StatCrunch. So you'll have certainly some short answer questions where I'm asking you to do computations, maybe like mean, median, standard deviation. But you also want to think bigger picture conceptually. So the difference between the mean and the median, when you would use one over the other, and which one might be larger in different contexts. For example, your book talks about resistance and what happens with the relationship with mean and median when you're skewed right versus skewed left. So don't get so focused in Chapter 3 on calculations that you forget to really go back to the concepts. So Chapter 3, you'll have a mix of types of questions. You want to make sure that you can calculate all of the basic things. Use the empirical rule. You do need to have those 68, 95, and 99.7 numbers memorized and be able to break down and answer questions involving the empirical rule when it doesn't necessarily fall into exactly one of those. So make sure you go back and study how you broke down those percentages. Grouped data, we practiced StatCrunch and by hand. Z-score formula will be on your midterm, but you also want to think big picture here. What does it mean if a z-score is positive versus a negative z-score? Could you judge who is doing relatively better based on their z-scores? So kind of same idea with quartiles, interquartile range, and range. What does that information tell you? If you have those numbers, can you use that to make decisions? And can you read and interpret a box plot to make some decisions as well? In Chapter 4, we were dealing with mostly linear regression, but also two-way tables. So I did not include that one here because we also saw tables in Chapter 5, so I stuck it on there. But focusing on linear regression for a second, you want to make sure you can certainly use your calculator StatCrunch to find all the needed components, including the R value, make predictions, find residuals, but the trickier part of Chapter 4 tended to be interpretations. This will be a little different than your My Math Lab because you will be writing me sentences explaining the slope, the y-intercept, and the r-squared value. So think about your project in relationship to this, and then also the discussion boards where we were looking at the slope interpretations and y-intercepts. If you have not gone back and looked at the different interpretations people wrote, and then my feedback on those, make sure you do that. So one of the things that is a little tricky is making sure your interpretations include information about the numbers and that you're tying in the context correctly. If you're struggling with the slope and y-intercept interpretations, go back and watch those Chapter 4 videos, in which I discuss several textbook examples and how to work through those interpretations. For Chapter 5, we're dealing with probabilities and tables. So think about your probability rules. I'm not going to ask you to write out the rules and symbols. You're going to be applying the rules to find probabilities. You will have an assortment of the or, and at least. You'll have some conditional probabilities, and some of these may be in tables. So think about the two-way tables. It was really easy to ask conditional probability questions and embed some of these here, as well as separate problems. So again, best place to study, really your My Math Lab questions, but go back and look at the Chapter 5 discussion board. We had some interesting discussion on how to compute some probabilities that could be a little bit tricky. For Chapter 6, you want to make sure that you can look at a table that breaks down a random variable and find the mean and standard deviation. But you also want to think about scenarios that were more word problem based, where we created our own table and found the expected value. Remember that the expected value is the same thing as the mean, but in different contexts, such as the insurance problems, the roulette wheel, and we had some other game examples, sometimes it could be a little bit tricky to create the same type of table that we saw in the beginning of 6.1. So make sure you go back and pay special attention to expected value and also the interpretation. What does it mean if your expected value is negative? What does it mean if it's positive? Then we also had binomial distribution in 6.2. You will have StatCrunch, so make sure that you can use that binomial calculator efficiently. And then let's see if I can scoot this down just a little bit. I think our last topic that I listed on here was mean and standard deviation for a binomial distribution. That is the mu equals n times p, and your standard deviation is the square root of n times p times 1 minus p. You will have those formulas written on the exam. You want to make sure that you know when to apply them. So being able to identify when something is a binomial and when you can use these formulas is an important component. Sometimes it can be a little bit tricky when I'm asking for probabilities to be able to identify, is it something I can do with the binomial calculator? Is it something I need to use probability rules? Or sometimes you have the option to apply some of both of the concepts. Some of the questions that we saw in Chapter 5 were actually binomial type questions, and you could use the binomial calculator instead of doing some of these methods. So make sure that as you're going back to study, I would recommend maybe picking some problems and not necessarily going in order of your chapters. Try to mix it up a little bit so you don't necessarily know what's coming. So hopefully this was helpful to think about organizing your study. As you have more questions this weekend, feel free to send me an email. And then I will see you guys on Tuesday for the midterm. I will send out probably on Monday the specific times I will be either in the room on Tuesday or in the office on Tuesday in case you have any last minute questions. I will not be proctoring the exam the whole time from noon to 8 p.m., but I will be there for several hours on Tuesday evening. All right, guys, hope you have a good weekend, and I will talk to you soon.